All right. Welcome again to another episode of the Better Brain Fitness Podcast. As usual, I am joined by my turbocharged co-host, Dr. Tommy Wood. Hello, Tommy.
Hello.
So, Tommy was recently asked to give his opinion about or on the question of whether or not a driver who is in their 40s can win a Formula One championship. And this was asked to him by the Times, the paper in London, not the New York Times. Uh, and and this kind of brings up a topic I think that's important to both of us, and one certainly relevant to this podcast. We've focused a good bit so far on, preventing dementia, cognitive decline, but just as important is what we can be doing to kind of help get the most out of our brains today, so we can continue to do the things we love and be effective at it. And I think, for the most part, those two things are well aligned. The better we perform today, the better our chances likely are that we will continue to be able to perform well and reduce our risk of decline in the future. So I think this is a good way to open the door to continue to talk about that. Tommy has background in specifically in performance optimization for Formula One drivers. So I'm very curious to hear his take on this topic. So, Tommy, take it away. Can a driver in their 40s win a Formula One championship?
Yes.
All right. We will see you guys next time.
um, yeah, I guess we could go into a little bit more depth. And as ever, um, when I've done some of these interviews for the for papers, it's happened a few times now, and there's been the basis of some a previous episode. And actually, I did another one that we didn't do an episode on it, but the Telegraph again in the UK asked me
Mhm.
lots of questions about a study about the health effects of dogs, and I wrote like, I don't know, 3 or 4 long pages
Yeah.
about dogs and the study. And then they use like 4 sentences of
Yeah.
what you write.
I've done this
So
before. You have like an hour-long telephone interview, and you might have one quote come in from it.
yeah.
Yeah.
But this is great for us and
Right.
for you, dear listeners, because I'll put my full responses to the questions on our Substack, and we'll talk about it. We get to talk about it more here because it didn't make it all into the publication. Um, so this is a particular interest in Formula One, primarily because of two drivers, and the focus of the article is on one driver, Fernando Alonso, who's a former world champion, but a long time ago, towards the beginning of his career, and he's now in his early 40s, and he's sort of having a bit of a renaissance. And the question was whether somebody like Fernando Alonso can win the Formula One World Championship, and the question also relates partly to Lewis Hamilton, who is now in his late 30s and is planning to continue to drive into his 40s, at least right now. He'll go to a new team next year in order to try and do that. So I do my Formula One work through a company called Hints at Performance. I've done that for the last 6 or 7 years, and I work with drivers and their coaches on various aspects of health and performance. So I do a little bit of everything.
Hmm.
To be honest, sometimes it's blood tests, nutrition, sleep,
Right.
wherever I might be able to lend a sort of a neuroscience kind of background and help people dig through some of the performance science. And I think there is a lot of interest in this more broadly. And in February, I did this event for CrossFit called CrossFit for Health, and I was part of this big panel on. Um, it was focused on the sort of the difference between, or the overlap between, health and performance, and the the two things are not necessarily synonymous.
Hmm.
And it's kind of stated that most professional athletes, like elite level athletes, they're very fit, but they're not necessarily very healthy, or what
Hmm.
they do to achieve that level of fitness is not necessarily particularly healthy. And one of the most common examples of that is something like a Tour de France bike rider who they have phenomenal power output on a bike, but ask them to run or jump or pick up anything heavy, and they might struggle because they're just so good at that one thing. Um, so when you think about health versus performance, and then how it relates to elite level performance, there's this increasing trend for athletes to have, like a 2 decade long career at the top of their sport. And there are examples across multiple sports. So in tennis, you have Djokovic and Federer and Nadal. In American football, we had Tom Brady. In basketball, we have LeBron James. There are these individuals who've really focused on keeping their health at the forefront so that they can continue to perform for long
Hmm.
periods of time. And I think that's one of the things that has changed in several elite sports is that people start to think about a legacy. It's not just how do I get by on my raw talent for a year or two and perform really well for one season. It's how do I keep this going for a decade or two. And when you listen to those individuals talk, they're always talking about diet, their specific training strategies, how they're looking after themselves, making sure they recover, because those things do become more important as you get older. Absolutely. And one thing that I mentioned in the article was that as you get older, probably two important things come to the forefront. One is you need to make training very specific to the adaptations you want to
Hmm.
achieve. You probably have less time and or less time to train or less ability to recover from very intense training. So make sure that everything you do has that singular goal in mind. Like each training session should have a very specific adaptation that you're trying to achieve. Whereas when you're younger, you pretty much do anything and you'll get fitter and stronger. But you do have to focus more, just like if you're older and trying to learn any skill, you just have to be very focused in terms of what you're trying to improve. But you still have amazing capacity to improve and maintain what you do gain if you are specific in your training. And then recovery becomes important as well. And then we've talked about how necessary it is to have these periods of adaptation and recovery so that you can gain the benefit of what you do, and be that with
Hmm.
your brain
Hmm.
or your body. And I think when one of the questions they asked, particularly related to Formula One drivers, was about reaction time. And
Hmm.
I broadened that out a little bit to processing speed in general, because reaction time off the line is important in Formula One, and it's something that actually I've spent a lot of time working on with some drivers and their coaches. But um, it then becomes more important how well you can manage multiple types of information happening at the same time, and process those, and then react and make decisions essentially, because you might have the radio going, you might have several cars around you. You have there are these there are some nice pictures available. We could probably find one that we use in some examples of, like, a steering wheel for a Formula One car is
Hmm.
just mind-bogglingly complex.
Yeah.
Just
Yes.
and like dials and switches are
Yes.
constantly being moved
Right.
and twiddled with, whilst also driving at 200 miles an hour and having
Right.
to navigate all these other
So
cars.
all
So
that has to be automatic, I'm sure.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, it is, and it is all automatic at
Totally.
that point,
Yeah.
because they've just been doing this for years. But
Right.
processing speed broadly is important because you have to be able to manage all of that.
Even if
And
they're automatic, processing
yeah,
speed is going to matter.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so processing speed does tend to, on average, decline with age. But some of the research that I've done and others have done, and some of the stuff that there's a paper that you and I, Josh, are going to start working on now. There are a number of modifiable factors
Hmm.
associated with processing speed related to nutrient status, sleep, other lifestyle factors, alcohol, physical fitness, all this other kind of stuff. So if you can address those factors, which the kinds of athletes who want to focus on performance for decades, who are very dedicated and often related to other conversations we've had, where um, as people get older, generally they just want to spend time, or they spend time doing other things. It's not that
Hmm.
they're not
Exactly.
capable. And it's not that these athletes aren't capable of always being able to perform for 2 decades. It's just it takes a very uh, certain type of person to
Right.
want to
Hard to sustain.
grind out everything that's necessary
Yeah.
to perform in Formula One for 20 years. Not everybody wants to do that, but if they do that, they have huge capacity to be able to improve and maintain
Hmm.
the level of performance that they have. And some of it, of course, is inherent. And these, these two drivers that we were talking about, they are, you know, without a doubt, two of the best drivers to have ever driven a Formula One car. So even as their powers start to drop off, which will happen at some point, they're still going to be way better
Right.
than most other people, and that is part of it. But it does require, a real attention to detail and just being willing to keep doing the things that can then make sure that they improve and maintain their performance. So that was kind of the summary of
Hmm.
of what I wrote in my answers. Any questions, clarifying comments, additional thoughts, Josh?
So at this point in time, and I know this is one of the things we're going to kind of try to dig into in terms of the research on the topic of like processing speed and so forth. But with respect to just reaction time, what in your experience would you consider to be kind of the biggest levers there if if you have someone you're trying to improve it in?
The the thing that we've focused on a lot, and actually I'm increasingly focusing on because it's just so critical for all aspects of complex um, motor or skill
Hmm.
performance, is the idea of optimizing arousal level.
Hmm.
Um, and people may know of the Yerkes Dodson arousal curve. I will give you, now that you asked, I'm going to give you a history of the Yerkes Dodson
All
arousal
right,
curve.
please.
So, the, this is it's quite a common idea in sports in particular. Um, but it all stems from a study that's now more than 100 years old that was done in mice. Um, the idea being that for complex skills, not for simple skills like reaction time, actually, but for
Hmm.
complex skills, there is this optimal curve or peak of arousal for a given type of performance. So if you imagine your bell curve on your x-axis along the bottom, you have arousal, so like how amped up you are, for want of a
Hmm.
better word, and on your y-axis you have performance, and it's a typical bell-shaped curve. So if your arousal is low, you're not engaged, you're not really in the right mindset to perform. If your arousal is very high, you're stressed, anxious, tense. We
Hmm.
know that when that happens, it's difficult to perform complex tasks. But somewhere in the middle is a sweet spot where, if we're talking about sports, you can enter clutch states for which are um, states where you achieve high levels of performance, but they're cognitively challenging, or through that high level or high peak of focus and performance, you could potentially achieve flow.
Hmm.
If this is a complex motor skill, and is certainly relevant to some sports, including Formula One. Um, so where this came from was a study where they were trying to get mice to learn, and they had a difficult learning task and a simple learning task. And what they found was that if they gave the mice an electric shock, they learned better because they were more aroused. You start
Hmm.
to you activate all those pathways of the brain, including dopamine and noradrenaline, and those things that we know are important for neuroplasticity.
Hmm.
And if it's a simple task, essentially, the more aroused, which is a nice word for saying the bigger the electric shock the mice were given, the better they performed. And that's actually for reaction time in general. That does seem to be the case. That just the greater your level of arousal, the faster your reaction time. And except you may get to a point where you're very very tense, and then it's sort of depending on how you're reacting or what you're reacting to, then performance may decrease. But essentially, it's not limited by arousal. Whereas when they had a complex task in the mice, what they found was that some shock was beneficial for learning, but then a very large shock, and then they learned less well. So this kind of idea for complex tasks,
Hmm.
being too aroused is detrimental to performance. And as I kind of described it, I think it intuitively makes a lot of sense. Like we can think about that from our daily lives, right? If you want to, you're an executive and you're giving a presentation to the board, and if you show up and you just woke up from a nap and you're just like not really thinking about it, right? You know you're not going to perform well. But also if you're super jittery, you had 18 cups of coffee and you're really stressed about your performance, you know that's also not necessarily going to lead you to you doing your best. So there's a sweet spot somewhere between the two. So to actually then get to your question, the the thing that you need to do to kind of find this sweet spot, and that there have been examples where um, a driver is over aroused, for
Mm-hmm.
want of a better word, and they'll still have a good reaction time off the line, but then they may make mistakes
Mm-hmm.
later during the race when those other aspects of cognitive function become more important, and those complex motor and decision making skills are negatively affected by being overstressed because if we think about the activation of the limbic system, the amygdala, you start to inhibit the ability of the prefrontal cortex to contribute to things like complex decision making. So um, then, depending on the individual, if you want them to react well or perform well,
Mm-hmm.
the real key is to get them into that right mode. Get them into the zone for want of a better word. And so again, just experiences across coaches with multiple drivers. I know coaches who had drivers who were just like super chill all the time. And so what they needed was loud music and
Right.
getting short sprints, and maybe their coach sort of like giving them some loud verbal encouragement.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of what helped increase their arousal and get them in the zone. And others, it depends on a lot of factors, but if they're anxious or stressed about a race or their performance, then it's going to be more about breath work, or maybe some meditation type stuff, or like how do we chill them out
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, or just get them to focus on something else. So then there may be some basic reaction time or responsive drills that just allow you to switch off some of the rumination or something that might be driving some anxiety
Right.
and could push you in that direction. So that's where a lot of it comes from. And then in the lead up to that, you're going to be thinking about nutrition, sleep, all these other things, like so you can lay the groundwork such that the person is in the best uh, position to perform well once you get them in the right zone. And of course, another thing with athletes, particularly elite level athletes, is that they're at greater risk of respiratory infections because they travel a lot. There's a lot of other stressors. So
Mm-hmm.
in general, compared to the general population, elite level athletes tend to have more respiratory viral illness, and it's related to training load and stress and travel and things like that. So doing everything you can to look after the individual in the weeks and days running up, and
Right.
then thinking about what you need to do to get them in the right state of mind in order to perform optimally when they need to.
Are there any supplements that people use for that specific purpose that have been shown to be effective?
Um, yeah, there are a few, but probably not that
No.
many.
Mm-hmm.
For a few reasons. One, because these are drug tested athletes,
Mm-hmm.
so you have to take stuff that
Right.
isn't going to be a problem. So caffeine is an obvious one
Mm-hmm.
if you're trying to increase arousal.
Mm-hmm.
But I know several stories of drivers who've over-egged
Right.
the caffeine
Right.
and regretted it later.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just because they're over aroused, and there's lots of research showing that in particular with caffeine, but also with some other stimulants, right? We feel good when we
Mm-hmm.
take it, and yes, reaction time will probably improve, and that's where caffeine is probably going to have the greatest benefit is reaction time off the line. But with complex skills,
Mm-hmm.
uh, function tends to decrease with stimulants like caffeine, even though we think we're performing well, we're actually performing worse.
Right.
So that has to be taken into account.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Creatine is another one,
Hmm.
of course. We haven't talked about creatine for a long time,
Yeah,
so I'm glad
we're
that
due. Yeah.
yeah, it's time to talk about it again. And it supports cognitive function as well as particularly in the setting of sleep deprivation or when somebody's had an issue with sleep, the creatine acutely, a single high dose seems to improve complex motor skill. That was tested in rugby players, but I think it's relevant to Formula One drivers. So that's one. And then there were a few other things that people might try out. Tyrosine potentially has some evidence for supporting cognitive function in like stressful
Hmm.
situations. So I know some drivers have tried that. Um, and in the lead up to uh, say a performance, and this is now relevant to lots of athletes and lots of people, right? And we thought about overall health and stress, like vitamin D status is critical to athletic performance. So that's something that's
Mm.
easily addressable if needed, both injury risk and performance and immune function. Um, Important for all of those. And then, um, yeah, in the settings of chronic stress, there's some reasonably good evidence for ashwagandha as a
Mm.
potential supplement. So I know some of the athletes I've worked with have tried that as well. Can improve sleep and subjective stress measures. Um, and not there isn't data in, well, there aren't data in professional athletes, but in sort of average adults, ashwagandha may also help improve performance a little bit.
Yeah. One interesting thing to point out with your answers here is almost all of them are conditional on the particular specifics of an athlete, right?
Yeah,
Which
yeah, of
like
course.
there aren't like we're always looking for the universals. What's the one supplement that's going to make me react
There isn't
faster,
one.
right?
Yeah, of course
Exactly.
not. Yeah,
Or that will improve my get my arousal in the sweet spot, right? It's going to be always individual. Um, so thinking about the fact that all of these professional athletes and like in the domain of tennis and basketball that we talked about are getting or continuing to perform at such a high level at an age that previously would have thought people thought wasn't possible. Makes me also think about the episode that we did about are the presidents fit for office, and one of the things
mm.
we talked about there is that as a general rule, your skills should continue to improve with age. And I
Yeah,
think one of the things that we're seeing, I know this is true, my favorite sport's tennis, in the realm of the Federers, Nadal, Djokovic, they were continuing to improve their skills over time, and the what I think their success showed us was that previously the lack of attention to health and recovery and so forth, didn't allow that to overcome
mm.
the downsides of that. And what we were seeing is this: they're continuing to distance themselves from the field by having this head start in their skills and continuing to add them, and through the experience of continuing to play as well, while at the same time, uh, you know paying closer attention to the hardware, on
Yeah,
which those skills run. And that was kind of the secret formula. And I think we're still, we don't know kind of how far you can push that, right? Um, but I think that all that those stories have really changed, uh, how we a lot of people think about aging and probably a lot of the misconceptions and biases were at odds with those stories, which is a good thing. And um, another thing that you talked about with respect to the CrossFit um, event that you went to was that at these elite levels of performance, you oftentimes are having to sacrifice health in some
mm.
way, right? And I think that one of the indicators of those costs is kind of how much effort it takes to drive an adaptation. And when you're at these elite levels of performance, you're having to spend so much effort to get less and less of a response or an adaptation. And and I think that that's a reflection of the cost, as well as the fact that those are the adaptations that come off the fastest when you stop training, right?
Yeah.
So it's clearly that the body is defending against, like, trying to get you not to do that, right? For a reason, right? And as soon as you stop doing that and asking it to do it, it's like we're stopping. We're gonna lose that adaptation. It's not worth the trade-off. So, it's clearly there is a point where in pushing yourself to that level, that it's almost impossible to not sort of undermine health in some way. But by the same token, what do you think uh, are the key lessons that can be learned from people in that domain, in terms for sort of for the everyday person who is wanting to, has sports they love or other activities they love to do, not necessarily trying to perform at the highest level, but what can be learned from, the athletes who are doing this for longer, that people can apply them to their own lives.
Yeah, I think there's two things that you can maybe think about. One goes back to being very specific about your
Hmm.
training. Um, and there's kind of removing what we would call junk volume, which is just like training for the sake of training. Like,
Hmm.
no, um, particularly as you juggling multiple demands and trying to perform in multiple areas, including the sport that you want to perform in. Um, you really make sure, if you are specifically training, if you're just like going and you're playing your pickleball game for the fun of playing pickleball, of course, like, don't overthink it. I'm not saying that, well, I'm not going to play the game because it's not
Right.
going to drive a specific adaptation. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. But
Right.
if you're going to focus concerted efforts into improving function in certain areas, like,
Hmm.
know what it is you're trying to improve, and like, just train specifically for that in that session.
Hmm.
And then the next part is um probably focusing on areas where you're weakest, because that's gonna
Hmm.
like raise your floor. And so for a lot of people, um, it's going to be different. So again, if we go to pickleball, maybe it's your aerobic fitness, right? Just being able to, I know you have to run around a lot around a court, but like
Hmm.
getting around the court, right? Just from a cardiovascular fitness capacity, right?
Yep.
You'll generate that the best with concerted aerobic exercise at generally at the most of it at a low level, sort of like zone 2, as we now call it, with some intermittent sprints, making up maybe 10 or 20%. But the bulk are sort of like low level stuff. So there are certain principles for cardiovascular fitness that you can do to improve that. Or maybe, and I think something particularly outside of strength related sports, I think resistance training and gaining muscle mass and strength is probably where people are not focusing enough.
Hmm.
And in endurance sports, there's lots of evidence to show that resistance training decreases injury risk. The goal is not necessarily to get massive, right? But if you can improve strength and you can improve the sort of the structural components of joints and muscles and things like that, then you're less likely to get injured, which may be rate limiting. Or maybe it's specific ball related skills, like, yeah, so you're fit and strong, right? I probably have enough fitness and strength to play pickleball, but my hand-eye coordination is probably not good enough. So like,
Right.
that's where I should focus if I was gonna play
Hmm.
you on the pickleball court, right? So focus on the things that are maybe going to be your rate limiters, and then you can use all of your skills to kind of to maximal effect for longer. And I think driving, Formula One driving, is a nice example of that, because Formula One drivers are very fit, but then their VO2 max is not as
Hmm.
high as a Tour de France cyclist, and they're very strong, but particularly in sort of the neck and upper body and core muscles, to try and keep them in, like, still in the car. Um, there was a nice picture, actually, in a recent race. One of the regular drivers of the car was sick, so he couldn't race. So they
Hmm.
brought in like the rookie reserve driver, and um, after the race, there was this big dent in the side pod, or not the if you know Formula One cars, not the side pod, but it's like the part of the car that's like right next to where the driver's head is,
Hmm.
because he didn't have the neck strength. So he kept on
Oh,
banging his head against like this
oh
inside of
man,
the car. And
right.
so, right, you have to be incredibly strong to deal with these
Hmm.
G-forces
Hmm.
for long periods of time. So that you have to be fit, but not like Tour de France cyclists fit, and you have to be strong, but not like powerlifter strong. And you have to have, then you also need a lot of cognitive skills and cognitive capacities. So it's nice because Formula One drivers need to be good across a broad range of things, but you don't need to. They don't need to spend vast amounts of time getting incremental improvements in any one of those, because once you're good enough, you're probably good enough.
Right.
Um, and that actually uh, was going to bring me on to my last point, which is the other aspect of prolonged performance in sport. Another good example is Messi in
Hmm.
soccer.
Right.
Um, and one thing that we know you get better at as you get older is we've talked about the building of wisdom and
Hmm.
crystallized intelligence, right? So when you've played a sport at the top level for 20 years,
Hmm.
you have a lot more sport related wisdom and intelligence than the majority of the players you're playing against.
Right.
So Messi is legendary because for the first 10 minutes of the game, he doesn't do anything. He just like stands around and watches, and then he figures out the game and he
Right.
just knows exactly where he needs to be, and he gets the most done with minimum effort because he's not as fit as he used to be,
Right. Right.
but he's got so much football brain and knowledge, or soccer, sorry, or depending on who we're talking to. So that's another thing is some of the best athletes do adapt their
Hmm.
style over time, as maybe they do get slightly less good at something, but they then rely on their experience
Right.
to continue to be able to operate at a high level. So that's a benefit of an aging
Right.
brain and an aging body. It means that they can do that.
And that gets to our push to try to reconceptualize aging not as a deterioration, but a
Mm.
metamorphosis or a shifting
Yeah.
of abilities over time. That's a great illustration. One final thing I was going to say is that to your point about, part of why people decline with age is just not wanting to maintain what it takes to sustain that level for so long. And there was a great study that was done by Anders Ericsson on pianists, where they took young experts pianists and young amateurs, and then they compare them to older experts and amateurs, and they compared them on two different kinds of motor tasks, one of which was kind of related to piano playing and one which wasn't. And on the task that was unrelated to piano playing, the younger people tended to do better, faster and a little more accurate. But when they compared the on the task that was related to piano playing, the older expert piano players performed better than the young amateur ones, so faster and more skilled, and were equally good as the young experts. And it was if those older experts had continued to practice. So the differentiator there was if they had maintained practice time over that period of time, which is less common, they were able to maintain that skill set to as skilled as people many years younger, which again illustrates that idea that oftentimes it's simply the fact that you're moving on to other things and not putting in the same amount of time and effort that would need to maintain all of those adaptations. And it also, speaks to the demand coupling concept, which is that,
Yeah.
we're going to that the brain is going to continue to support the things and maintain the things that we ask of it. So if a pianist is asking their brain to continue to maintain, at this high level, it will. And final thing, I guess, is that one of the pianists that I like to show people is Martha Aldrich, she's in her early 80s and considered one of the world's best pianists still. And you see clips of her, and it's just incredible. And I remember I saw Doc Watson playing guitar, in his early 80s in concert, and it was, you know, fantastic, right? It was like there was most guitarists would, you know, give their left thumb to be able to play like that, right?
Hmm.
So, you know, was he not picking quite as fast as he was in his 30s or 20s? Maybe. Did it matter?
Yeah.
No, you know. So, I mean, we get wrapped up in these narratives around aging and decline, but really, you know, so much of it is modifiable, and so little of it, so much less of it is inevitable than we think. And you know what is, because if there is, you know, some inevitable component, the practical impact of it in many cases is negligible, you know, for the things that we love to do and that make us happy.
Yeah.
So reason to be optimistic about that, and reasons to care about the factors that actually do lead to deterioration that we can modify. So that's my last bits. Anything else to add, Tommy?
No, I think wouldn't want to ruin it by adding on to that. I think that that sums up really
All
nicely.
right. Well, certainly revisit this more topic in the future. But great discussion, and we'll put up Tommy's full responses too on the Substack newsletter. All right. Thank you all for listening. If you have any questions for us related to this topic or anything else in the realm of brain health and fitness, send it our way by going to brainjoe.academy/questions. All right. Thanks so much, Tommy.
Thank you.
All
Thanks
right.
everybody for
Bye-bye.
listening.